In May of 2014, 18-year-old Drake Robinson set out on a solo hike along the Appalachian Trail and disappeared without a trace. Exactly 1 month had passed, and when a group of geologists looked into an old coyote lair in a remote gorge, they found not an animal, but a missing boy sleeping among gnawed bones and growling at the men. This was no ordinary survival. Who exactly turned a man into a wild creature, and what really happened in that forest? You will find out in this video. Enjoy. On May 2nd, 2014, Friday morning, 18-year-old Drake Robinson arrived at a gravel parking lot at the foot of Standing Indian Mountain. It was 7 o'clock and 45 minutes. The southern Appalachians greeted him with the coolness and quiet that usually prevails here before the start of the hiking season. Drake had been preparing for this solo hike for months. He was not a beginner looking for spectacular photos, but acted methodically and prudently. His backpack was packed perfectly, weight distributed, equipment checked, topographic map with markings in the top flap. He planned to hike a 3-day loop covering part of the famous Appalachian Trail and returned to his car on Sunday evening, May 15th. According to his father, who later testified to the police, the boy hid the keys to his old pickup truck under the rear bumper. It was a family habit that only the closest ones knew about. Drake checked the lacing on his shoes, slung his backpack over his shoulders, and headed deep into the woods, where the morning mist still clung to the tops of the century-old oaks. The weather was perfect that day. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a group of hikers descending from a ridge lookout met Drake on a narrow, rocky section of trail. This was the only confirmed contact with the boy. During the reconstruction of the events, one of the witnesses told detectives that he remembered Drake because of his confident gait. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. Drake asked if there was water at the spring near the shelter further up the ridge. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, he didn't look tired or disoriented. On the contrary, he seemed to be in control. The hikers went down, and Drake disappeared around a bend in the trail that led to a dense rhododendron thicket. On May 5th, a Sunday evening, Drake's mother's phone went silent. The parents waited until late at night, hoping their son had simply gotten stuck on a difficult section or gone out of coverage. But when Monday morning came and there was still no contact, Drake's father got in his car and drove to the trailhead. In the parking lot, he found his son's pickup truck. The car was standing exactly where Drake had left it on Friday. It was covered with a layer of morning dew and pine pollen, and a spider had already spun a web between the wheel and the asphalt, a sign that the car hadn't moved for several days. The father found the keys under the bumper and opened the door, but there was no note or sign of his return. An official search operation was launched on May 6th at noon. It was one of the largest missions in the region in recent years. The search involved Forest Service rangers, Macon County Sheriff's officers, and several volunteer groups. The first 48 hours seemed promising. Helicopters with thermal imagers scanned the slopes, trying to pick up the heat radiation of a person among the cold rocks. Ground teams broke into squares and methodically combed the forest. They checked every clearing, every cave, every ledge where they could hide from the wind. But on the third day, the mountains showed their character. The weather changed dramatically. Heavy clouds settled right on the peaks, covering the forest with a thick, pitch-black fog. A steady, cold rain began to fall. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. The aircraft had to be called back to base, and the ground teams could barely move along the eroded slopes. The only hope was the dogs. The canine team arrived on the scene with bloodhounds. The animals were allowed to sniff the seats of Drake's pickup truck, and they confidently picked up the trail. The dogs led the searchers up the trail, following the exact route described by witnesses. The handler who led the team later noted in a report that the dogs worked with precision and focus. They walked several miles, past the first campsites, and reached the area of a small mountain stream in a deep hollow. And then something happened that baffled even the veteran rescuers. Right at the water's edge, the dogs stopped. They began circling in place, nervously sucking in air, and refused to cross to the other side. It wasn't like losing a scent through water. Usually a dog looks for the scent's exit on the opposite side. Immediately, the scent just stopped. The rescuers examined the banks up and downstream for half a mile. No signs of slipping, no broken branches, no boot prints on the soft silt. The ground was clean, as if an 18-year-old boy with a heavy backpack had simply vanished into thin air at that point. Week after week passed, rain washed away all hope. The search area expanded to thousands of acres of wild forest. Volunteers checked the bear attack theory, but biologists found no signs of predators. No blood, no pieces of clothing. The version of crime also came to a standstill. Drake had no enemies, and his belongings did not appear in pawnshops or stores. On the 14th day of the search, when all reasonable time for survival had passed, the county sheriff officially announced the suspension of the active phase of the operation. The protocol contained a dry wording. The object of the search was not found. There are no traces of his presence. The rangers rolled up their tents, leaving the forest alone with its mystery. To everyone, it looked like a tragic accident. None of those combing the thicket even suspected that Drake had not left the forest, and that what was happening to him in those moments was far from the concept of death. Exactly 1 month has passed since 18-year-old Drake Robinson last closed the door of his pickup truck in the parking lot of the Standing Rock Indian. On the 2nd of June, 2014, the official search had long since been wound down, and his photographs on the information boards had faded in the mountain sun and rain. The area where hundreds of volunteers had searched for him had returned to a normal rhythm, and only the wind rustled through the trees, keeping the mystery of his disappearance alive. That morning, a group of 4 geologists arrived at a remote sector known locally as the Kensington Sector. It's a rocky outcrop overhanging the valley, a wild and dangerous place far off the beaten path of marked hiking trails. The expedition's plan was to investigate soil erosion on the eastern slope, where new landslides had formed after the May rains. According to the group leader, as recorded later in his official report, they were moving along a narrow technical trail, wading through dense thickets of mountain laurel. The terrain there is difficult. Sharp changes in elevation, slippery stones, and deep ravines that rarely receive direct sunlight. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, the group descended into a gorge sometimes labeled Wolf Gully on old maps. It was a gloomy place where the air smelled of dampness, mold, and wet stones. One of the geologists checking the stability of the slope, the tree had probably fallen during a storm a few years ago, and its massive root system had torn a whole layer of soil out of the ground, creating a deep, dark cavity under the trunk. It looked like an ideal den for a bear or coyote, so the group stopped at first, keeping their distance. The geologist later told investigators that a strange sound caught his attention. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the sound of wind. It was a quiet, rhythmic crunching sound, as if someone or something was gnawing on a bone inside the hole. Then he noticed movement, a subtle shifting of a shadow, deep in the root plexus. Believing there might be an injured animal, the researchers began to approach slowly, keeping bear deterrents at the ready. As the beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness beneath the roots, what they saw made them freeze. Inside, on a pile of rotten leaves mixed with dirt, feathers, and white fragments of small bones, lay a creature. At first, the geologists could not understand what they were looking at. The object was twisted into a tight ball, limbs pulled up to its chest, face hidden in its knees. Its skin was covered with a layer of dry dirt and soot, and its hair was tangled in a single, continuous tangle of debris and branches. It was a human being. Her clothes had turned to rags. The synthetic jacket that might have once been green hung in tatters, revealing a thin, emaciated body. Her pants were torn to the knees, and she had no shoes. Her feet were bare, covered with scratches, bruises, and baked blood. According to witnesses, at first they thought they had found the body of a dead tourist. The state of exhaustion was critical. The ribs were protruding so that it seemed the skin was about to crack, and the spine was clearly visible through the dirty fabric. Around him were the remains of food that a normal person could not eat: gnawed rodent bones, raw bird paws, pieces of bark. But then the body moved. One of the geologists, trying not to make any sudden movements, called out loudly, asking if he needed help. The reaction they received in response was so shocking that it was included in all subsequent reports as an example of complete degradation of social behavior. The boy did not raise his head, as a person who heard a rescue voice would do. He shuddered sharply, as if electrocuted, and instantly rolled over onto his stomach, pressing himself to the ground. When he raised his face to the light, the geologists saw eyes full of wild, primitive terror. It was Drake Robinson. His features, though distorted by hunger and dirt, were still recognizable from the postcard photographs. But there was no recognition in his eyes. There was not even a glimmer of human understanding that he was facing help. He did not say a word. Instead, a sound that witnesses described as a low, vibrating growl, the sound of a cornered animal ready to defend its life, came from his throat. The boy began to slowly back away from the hole, keeping his eyes on the people. His movements were unnatural. He leaned on his arms and legs at the same time, moving on all fours with frightening agility. When the geologist stepped forward to try to calm him down, Drake bared his teeth. His lips trembled, and his teeth were black with earth and blood. He acted as if the light of the lantern was causing him physical pain, and the presence of humans was a mortal threat. Inside the lair, there was a heavy smell of unwashed body and excrement. The geologists realized that they would not be able to simply pull him out. The guy was in a state of altered consciousness, and any attempt at physical contact could provoke aggression or force him to run away into the forest, where he would definitely die in this state. The team leader immediately contacted the rescue service by satellite phone, reporting the discovery of a live man in serious condition in the Pickens Nose area. As they waited for help to arrive, Drake continued to sit deep in the hole, clutching a piece of sharp bone in his hand as if it were a makeshift weapon. He did not respond to his name. He did not respond to the offer of water. He just stared out of the darkness with wide, unblinking eyes that had nothing left of the 18-year-old student who had set out a month ago to hike with plans for the future. What was found in Wolf Gulch was Drake Robinson's body, but the mind that controlled that body belonged to someone else, a creature who had forgotten what it meant to be human. And this transformation happened in just 30 days. For the investigators who arrived on the scene an hour later, it was the beginning of a new chapter. What looked like a disappearance had now turned into something much darker. The boy was not lost. He was not just found. Someone or something had changed him beyond recognition, breaking all the barriers of a civilized psyche. And the lair under the oak tree was only the final point of this horrific process. The evacuation of Drake Robinson to the Franklin County Hospital on June 3, 2014, was carried out in complete secrecy. The doctors in the emergency room who examined the boy were initially preparing to record the effects of severe hypothermia and exhaustion. However, the results of a detailed blood test, which came in the next morning, changed the vector of this story from a medical case to a criminal offense. The toxicology report, signed by the chief physician, stated that a high concentration of strong psychotropic substances was found in the patient's blood. These were not natural toxins from poisonous mushrooms or berries that a lost hiker could have eaten by mistake. It was a complex cocktail of synthetic sedatives and hallucinogens. According to medical experts, such substances cannot be obtained by accident. They were administered systemically, probably for several weeks, to suppress the will and induce a state of altered consciousness. This fact was the basis for the immediate opening of a criminal case under the article on kidnapping and forcible detention. Macon County Police launched a large-scale canvass of residents within a 20-mile radius of the place where the boy was found. Investigators were looking for anyone who might have had access to specific drugs or acted suspiciously during the May search. On the second day of work, the district officers received a name that locals pronounced with a mixture of fear and disgust: Arthur Graves, known as Swampy. Graves was a 62-year-old hermit who lived in a makeshift cabin on the edge of a swampy patch of forest, just 4 miles from the area where Drake's trail disappeared. His reputation was unequivocal, an aggressive, unpredictable man who considered the forest his own. There are several police reports on Graves in the police archives. He was detained twice for poaching, illegal shooting of deer in a protected area, and complaints from tourists were recorded, whom he threatened with an old hunting rifle, demanding that they leave his territory. A key piece of evidence emerged after the re-interview of witnesses who were in the parking lot on the day Drake disappeared. The owner of a small shop near the trailhead recalled seeing an old, rust-covered, dark green SUV driving toward the trailhead in the early morning hours of May 2nd. According to the witness, the car had a distinctive feature: a broken taillight covered with red tape. The description perfectly matched Arthur Graves's car. This gave the investigation sufficient grounds to obtain a search and detention warrant. The operation was scheduled for June 7th. The takedown team, reinforced by state officers, approached Graves' cabin at dawn. The hermit's home resembled a pile of garbage that had grown into the trees. Walls of plywood and rotten logs, a tarped roof, and mountains of scrap metal and old tires all around. When the police ordered Graves to come out with his hands up over a megaphone, the response was a shot in the air. The man barricaded himself inside, shouting curses and threats. According to the team leader's report, the negotiations lasted less than an hour. Graves behaved erratically, shouting about federal agents and promising to defend his home to the last bullet. The police used stun grenades. The assault was swift. The door was smashed in with a battering ram, and a minute later, Graves was already being taken outside in handcuffs. He resisted, spat at the officers, and laughed, demonstrating a complete lack of fear. The real horror was revealed during a search of the property. Officers examined every corner of the cluttered yard. In a dilapidated shed behind the cabin, among tools, rusty traps, and animal skins, they found items that made investigators believe they had caught a serial killer. On a workbench covered with a layer of grease was a black-handled camping knife. It looked remarkably similar to the one Drake's father had described as part of his son's gear. But the most striking discovery was in the corner of the shed. There, under a tarp, was a pile of clothes. These were not Graves's own. These were colorful windbreakers, fleece jackets, hiking pants of various sizes, from children's to adult. Some items looked old, moth-eaten, others relatively new. Investigators removed each item in a separate bag, realizing that they could be looking at evidence of dozens of unsolved crimes. One officer noted in the report that the clothes were dirty, with blood-like stains, although the exact nature of the contamination was to be determined by a laboratory. The news of Arthur Graves' arrest was instantly spread by local and national media. Newspapers ran headlines about the woodland maniac who had been hunting hikers in the Appalachian Mountains for years. Graves was a perfect fit for the role of the main villain, reclusive, armed, aggressive, with a collection of other people's belongings. Journalists theorized that it was he who kidnapped Drake, drugged him, and dumped him in the woods when he got tired of him or became too much trouble. The public demanded a speedy trial. People finally had the name of someone to blame for all the fears associated with the forest. It seemed like the puzzle had been solved. The police had a suspect, a motive, and physical evidence. No one at that time doubted that Swampy Graves was the monster who had broken the life of an 18-year-old boy. The investigation was preparing to file charges, not realizing that this version, which looked so convincing and logical, was actually leading them down the wrong path. and that the real evil was hiding much deeper and had a completely different face. For the next 2 weeks after the high-profile arrest of Arthur Graves, the Macon County Sheriff's Office became the center of attention for the entire state's press. Journalists were on duty at the porch, waiting for news of the confession of the woodland maniac who had allegedly turned the young hiker's life into a nightmare. Behind the closed doors of the interrogation room, however, the situation looked very different from what was being reported on the evening news. Investigators worked with Graves every day, using a variety of tactics, ranging from pressuring him with evidence to trying to establish a rapport. But the old recluse proved to be a surprisingly difficult suspect. According to the interrogation reports, which were later included in the case file, Graves behaved defiantly, often shouting and refusing to answer direct questions. However, on the 5th day, he changed his tactics. He partially admitted guilt, but not to the charges against him. Arthur confirmed that he had been robbing tourist campsites for years. He described in detail how he waited until travelers went to viewpoints or fell asleep to take food, lanterns, knives, and warm clothes from their tents. For him, it was a way of survival, a kind of hunting for resources brought by urban outsiders. But when it came to Drake Robinson, his tone changed. Graves categorically, to the point of hysteria, denied any physical contact with the boy. The most surprising thing about his testimony was an episode he told investigators at the end of the first week of interrogations. Graves said he did see Drake in the woods, but it happened after the official search had shifted to another sector. He claimed to have come across the boy at dusk near a stream in Wolf Gulch. However, as the suspect assured him, it was not a person anymore. Graves described that the boy was moving on 4 limbs, unnaturally arching his back and making sounds similar to the howl of a wounded wolf. The hermit, who had spent his entire life in the wild and was not afraid of bears or armed rangers, admitted that he was not afraid of bears, admitted that at that moment he felt animal fear. He said that there was nothing human in that guy's eyes, so he did not dare to approach, but simply ran away, deciding not to mess with what he considered a manifestation of evil spirits or madness. Investigators were skeptical of this story. In the detectives' reports, Graves' words were characterized as an attempt to fake a mental disorder or delusional rant aimed at distracting attention. The police were convinced that the old man was trying to justify his inaction and conceal the fact of the violence. The version that the poacher was simply afraid of the exhausted teenager looked unconvincing against the background of the things found in his shed. However, while the detectives were trying to extract a confession, the forensic laboratory completed the analysis of the physical evidence seized during the search of the hut, and the results of these examinations began to destroy the prosecution's case like a house of cards. The first blow was the identification of the clothes. None of the clothing items found in the pile of rags in Graves' barn belonged to Drake Robinson. Experts found that these were old items stolen from various tourists between 2010 and 2013. Some of the owners were identified through theft reports filed years earlier. Neither Drake's synthetic jacket, nor his boots, nor his backpack were in Graves' possession. The next disappointment was the knife. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be a cheap Chinese-made model that could be purchased at any hardware store in the state. Although it visually resembled Drake's knife, the serial numbers and wear marks did not match. The blade showed no traces of the boy's DNA, only residues of animal fat and resin, which confirmed Graves's claim that the knife was used for domestic purposes and game processing. But the decisive turn in the case came when the extended results of the toxicological examination of the victim's blood came in. The initial analysis showed the presence of psychotropic substances, but now the laboratory was able to accurately identify the composition. It was not just a drug. Drake's blood revealed a rare synthetic drug from the group of neuroleptics, which is used exclusively in specialized veterinary medicine. According to a certificate provided by experts, this substance is used in zoos and reserves to suppress aggression and sedate large predators, bears, lions, or tigers, during transportation. This chemical compound is not sold in pharmacies and is not available on the black market of street drugs. Its circulation is strictly controlled, and special permits are required for its use. Moreover, the drug requires an extremely precise dosage. The slightest mistake in the calculation of body weight could instantly stop a person's heart. The fact that Drake remained alive for a month under the influence of this substance indicated that his kidnapper had deep knowledge of pharmacology and was able to calculate maintenance doses, balancing on the brink of life and death. Investigators were forced to look at Arthur Graves from a new angle. They were looking at a man who could barely read and write, leaving a crooked cross instead of a signature. He lived without electricity, without access to the internet, without connections in scientific or medical circles. Nothing more complicated than aspirin and alcohol was found in his hut. The idea that this illiterate hermit could have obtained a rare veterinary drug, calculated its molecular action, and administered it intravenously or intramuscularly for weeks while maintaining sterility was absurd. Graves may have been a thief, a poacher, and an aggressive misanthrope, but he was physically and intellectually incapable of organizing this complex psychochemical process. The forest maniac, who had already been condemned by the press, turned out to be a false target. The police realized that they had wasted precious time chasing a ghost, while the real criminal, educated, methodical, and much more dangerous, remained at large. Graves' story about the boy running on all fours ceased to sound like a delusion and acquired a sinister meaning. It was a description of the effects of a drug that turned a person into an animal. The investigation reached a dead end, and the detectives had to admit that they were looking for a savage, but they should have been looking for a scientist. On June 23, 2014, the case of Drake Robinson's abduction was virtually stagnant. The hermit version of the story had fallen apart, and the police had no other suspects. But nature, which a month ago had hidden the crime with fog and rain, now decided to reveal its consequences. The night before, a powerful storm had swept through the Nantahala National Forest. The wind broke old trees, eroded slopes, and changed the landscape beyond recognition. The next morning, Forester Thomas Reed traveled to a remote sector of the forest to assess the damage and check on fire breaks. This area was a few miles northeast of Wolf Gulch, the site where Drake was found. There were no hiking trails leading to this area, and even rangers rarely visited due to the difficult terrain and dense thickets of mountain laurel. According to Reed's words recorded in his official memo, he was walking around an array of fallen beeches when he noticed a strange glow in the crown of a nearby tree. Looking up, he saw the lens of a surveillance camera. This was no ordinary animal trap hung by hunters. The device was carefully disguised as bark, painted in spotted camouflage and pointed downward. Reed came closer and realized that the uprooted roots exposed not just the ground, but part of an artificial structure. It was the entrance to a disguised dugout, the roof of which had been so skillfully laid with sod and moss that it was indistinguishable from a natural hill from a distance of 5 paces. The front door was made of thick boards lined with felt for soundproofing. The lock had been torn off by the weight of the fallen tree. The forester immediately called for backup on his radio, but realizing the signal was weak, decided to inspect the perimeter. He found 3 more cameras in nearby trees. All of them looked at the entrance to the dugout, creating a dead zone of control. This was not a poacher's hideout or an amateur survivalist's stash. This was a system. When the team of detectives arrived, led by the officer in charge of Drake's case, they went inside. The air in the room was heavy, stale, with a pungent smell of chlorine and unwashed body. The dugout was spacious, reinforced with beams, with a wooden floor. The setting inside resembled a scene from a nightmare, rationalized with a cold scientific approach. Along the far wall, were cages. They were welded from thick reinforcing mesh, but their dimensions were not suitable for animals. They were too tall for dogs and too narrow for bears. They were human-sized cages. Inside one of them, a dirty straw bedding lay on the floor. Nearby were two metal bowls, one for water and the other for food. When the forensic scientist picked up one of the bowls to bag it as evidence, he saw an inscription on the bottom. Someone had scratched two words into the metal with a sharp object, possibly a nail or a stone. Object 14. This meant that Drake was not the first, and probably not the last. The long table at the entrance was perfectly organized, in stark contrast to the filth in the cages. There was a set of tools that looked more at home in a behaviorist's lab than in a forest hideout. Investigators found stun collars modified to fit necks larger than those of dogs. Nearby were remote controls, clickers for training, stopwatches, and syringes with the remains of a clear liquid. But the most valuable find was the papers. In the center of the table was a stack of thick notebooks with black covers. These were diaries. The handwriting was small, neat, and without any emotional deviations or blotches. The author of the entries chronicled his actions with frightening meticulousness. The first page of the open notebook had a heading: Protocol for the Regression of the Human Psyche to the Primate State. Phase of Active Conditioning. The detective began to read aloud. The text described the process of systematic destruction of the human personality. Day 3. Subject refuses to eat stimulus of the third level. Applied verbal activity is maintained. Asks to be released. Forbidden to respond to speech. Any attempt at communication is punished by sleep deprivation. Day 10. Subject 14 shows first signs of disorientation. Speech becomes fragmented. K9 drug is administered to suppress cognitive functions. Reaction to food becomes instinctive. The entries explained in detail what the doctors saw in the hospital. The author of the diary described how he made Drake forget human habits. The boy was punished for walking on two legs, for trying to speak, for crying. He was rewarded with food only when he behaved like an animal. Ate from a bowl without hands, growled or crawled on his knees. It was not the chaos of a madman, it was a cruel experiment. In one paragraph, the author noted, "The purpose of the experiment is to prove the fragility of social settings. Man is but a trained monkey. If you take away comfort and add fear, civilization disappears in 3 weeks." The last entry in the notebook is dated the day before the geologists found Drake. Subject 14 is ready for field testing, regression complete, releasing to the environment for final observation. Now everything made sense. Drake hadn't run away or gotten lost. He'd been released like a lab rat to see if he could survive in the woods with the mind of a frightened animal. The dugout was empty, but it spoke louder than any witness. Temperature charts, drug dosage regimens, and maps of the area with marked observation zones. The killer, or as he thought of himself, the researcher, watched everything through cameras. He didn't hide in the chaos. He created his own terrifying system in the heart of the forest. And although the criminal himself was not inside, he left behind a trail that led not just to his identity, but to his mania. Investigators seized the notebooks with trembling hands. They understood. The person who wrote this considered himself a scientist, and Drake Robinson was just a consumable for his dissertation on pain. And somewhere in these records, among the formulas and graphs, there had to be the name of the person who had turned a man into Object 14. On June 24, 2014, the State Police Analytical Department received results that turned the chaotic collection of evidence from the forest dugout into a clear profile of the perpetrator. The key to the solution was not the gruesome diaries, but the purely technical details of the equipment found at the crime scene. The stun collars, which had been modified to be worn around the human neck, had partially preserved serial numbers on the internal chips. An inquiry to the manufacturer of the special equipment yielded instant results. This batch had been produced 5 years ago on a special order for a service dog training center of a private security firm based in Atlanta. However, the customer was not the firm, but a specific individual who had a license to work with complex animal psychology. The name on the invoice matched the name of the person to whom the batch of the rare neuroleptic found in Drake Robinson's blood was registered. It was Dr. Silas Wayne. For the residents of the quiet town of Franklin, located near the National Forest, 70-year-old Silas Wayne was the model of a respectable retiree. He lived in a well-kept house on the outskirts of town, grew rare varieties of roses, and bought a newspaper every Sunday at the local neighborhood newsstand. Who were later interviewed by detectives, described him as a polite but reserved intellectual who never raised his voice and had no conflicts with the law. None of them could imagine that things beyond human understanding were happening in this man's basement or in his forest laboratory. However, the dossier that the detectives pulled up from military and civilian archives painted a completely different portrait. In the 90s, Silas Wayne served as a military psychologist in a unit that trained Special Forces soldiers to survive under extreme stress. His specialty was psychological resilience in sensory deprivation. However, his career in the armed forces ended abruptly. His discharge papers contained a vague wording, "failure to meet the ethical standards of the command." Later, it turned out that Wayne went to work at a closed kennel for service dogs, where animals were trained for search and assault operations. He worked there for almost 10 years until an internal scandal erupted in 2008. The management of the institution dismissed him without the right to work with animals. The reason was his methods. Wayne didn't train dogs. He broke their psyche, using electricity and hunger to turn them into mindless instruments of aggression. Colleagues recalled that he called it cleansing instinct of unnecessary emotions. Investigators analyzing his scientific publications and surviving drafts realized that Wayne was obsessed with one idea that grew into a mania over the years. He called it the theory of primal survival. In his understanding, modern man was a mistake of evolution, weak, dependent on comfort, unprepared for reality. Wayne believed that civilization is a disease that suppresses the true potential of the species. His goal was to prove that under the layer of education, language, and morality, every person hides an ideal beast capable of surviving in any conditions if it is properly activated. To do this, in his opinion, it was necessary to destroy the human I. The tools for this were stress, chemicals, and rigorous behaviorist training. Drake Robinson had the misfortune to be the perfect candidate to test this theory. Young, physically healthy, he was alone in the woods, becoming easy prey for a predator who was watching him through the sights of a tranquilizer gun. The reconstruction of the events that the detectives put together based on Wayne's notes was terrifying in its detail. On May 2, 2014, Wayne didn't just meet Drake on the trail. He hunted him down using an air rifle with darts. He immobilized the boy on a remote section of the trail. Before he knew it, the world had gone black. He woke up in a cage in the same dugout, surrounded by the smell of chlorine and metal. The smell of chlorine and metal. Wayne methodically implemented his plan. He didn't torture for fun. He was working. Every time Drake tried to speak, ask for help, or just cry, he received a shock through the collar. The pain was a direct result of human behavior. Instead, when the boy started eating from a bowl without hands because of hunger, when he crawled on the floor or made unintelligible sounds, Wayne gave him food and turned off the bright light, giving him peace. The drugs administered by the professor suppressed cognitive brain functions, blurred memory, and increased the feeling of fear. Drake had no chance to resist. His brain, attacked by chemistry and pain, began to adapt to the only rules that guaranteed survival. Be quiet, be submissive, be an animal. In Wayne's notes, this process was described dryly, like a laboratory report. Day 20th. Subject completely abandoned upright walking. No response to voice commands. Fear of light is fixed. Subject is ready for release into the wild. This explained Drake's condition when the geologists found him. He was not crazy in the usual sense. He was the result of a successful experiment, from Wayne's point of view. The guy survived the hole not because he remembered the lessons of tourism, but because his mind had regressed to a state where cold and mud were perceived as normal, and people as a threat. The police now had the full picture. They knew who did it, how he did it, and why Silas Wayne, a respected retiree from Franklin, was actually the architect of hell who decided to play God in the Appalachian woods. The arrest warrant was signed by a judge immediately. The takedown team prepared to leave, realizing they were dealing with a man who knew more about psychology and tactics than any of them. Wayne was not just a criminal. He was a professional who had turned his home and the forest around it into a testing ground for his own morbid research. The operation had to be carried out quietly to prevent him from destroying the last of the evidence or escaping to where he felt strongest: the wild. On June 25, 2014, the operation to apprehend Silas Wayne entered a decisive phase. The county police received information that the suspect had placed a pre-order for a new batch of specialized neuroleptics at a veterinary pharmacy in neighboring Jackson County. The arrest took place at 10:40 a.m. Wayne was standing at the counter, calmly checking the labels on the vials, when 4 plainclothes officers entered the room. According to witnesses, the pharmacist and 1 customer, the elderly man did not offer any resistance. He only slowly put his glasses in his jacket pocket and held out his hands for handcuffs, maintaining a look of complete indifference on his face. The arrest report states that Wayne did not ask any questions about the reason for his arrest, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. On the same day, the investigative team arrived at his home in Franklin to conduct a full search. The ground floor was in perfect order. Shelves of books on psychology, well-kept potted plants, classic furniture. It was the home of an intellectual, which did not give away the dark side of the owner's life. The real horror was hidden behind an inconspicuous door in the pantry that led to the basement. The room was equipped with professional soundproofing. The walls were lined with acoustic foam that absorbed any sound. In the center of the room stood a table with a computer and several external hard drives. When the forensic team accessed the files, they found terabytes of video carefully sorted by date and subject number. These were chronicles of torture that Wayne called scientific work. On the monitor, the investigators saw Drake Robinson. The video recorded every stage of his transformation, from the first days when he was screaming and begging for help to the final weeks when he was completely naked and dirty, moving around the camera on 4 limbs, frightened by his own shadow. The camera recorded the moments of drug administration, reaction to electroshock, and the process of forced feeding from a bowl. The interrogation of Silas Wayne lasted more than 6 hours. Detectives who were present in the room later noted in reports that they had never encountered such a level of cold cynicism. Wayne did not deny his actions. He spoke of them with pride, using academic terminology. According to the transcript of the interrogation, he told investigators, "You call it a crime. I call it a salvation. I freed him. I removed the shackles of society, morality, and unnecessary thoughts. I returned him to a state of pure, perfect predator." He felt no guilt for the boy's suffering. In his distorted reality, pain was just a tool necessary for purification. Wayne was convinced that he had done Drake a favor by giving him the ability to survive on a level of instinct inaccessible to the average person. The key moment of the confession concerned the events of early June. Wayne said that when the training process reached the final stage and Drake finally lost touch with his humanity, he decided to conduct one last test. At night, he took the boy to the Pickens Knolls area, a rocky area known for its large population of wild coyotes. Wayne admitted that he let Drake out near the old den for the sole purpose of, "I gave him a chance to become part of the forest," Wayne said in the minutes. He had to live or die as a free creature, not as a weak human being. The fact that Drake hid in the hole and survived was seen by Wayne as a success of his experiment, not a tragedy. Based on these testimonies and the seized videos, the prosecutor's office was able to clear Arthur Graves. The hermit, whom the press had dubbed the forest maniac, was officially found not to be involved in the kidnapping of Drake Robinson. DNA testing finally confirmed that he had never had contact with the boy. However, Graves did not manage to completely avoid punishment. Due to the stolen belongings of other tourists found in his shed, the court sentenced him to 2 years in prison for numerous thefts and poaching Graves, who became an accidental victim of circumstances and stereotypes. Went to prison while the real monster is educated. Dr. Wayne, the educated, quiet, and unnoticeable Dr. Graves, was preparing for the trial that would reveal to the world the depth of his madness. The investigation was over, but the question of whether Drake would ever be able to return from the state into which Wayne had driven him remained open. The trial of Dr. Silas Wayne began in September 2014 in the Franklin County Court. This case, which has already been called the Wolf Gulch Experiment, attracted the attention of not only the local press, but also national channels. The courtroom was crowded every day of the hearings. The public wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had turned science into a tool of torture. But Wayne, sitting in the dock, remained unmoved. He took notes in a notebook and occasionally adjusted his glasses, as if he were attending a boring academic lecture rather than his own sentencing. The defense line was based on the strategy of recognizing the defendant as insane. The lawyers insisted that Wayne had lost touch with reality, that his actions were dictated by a deep mental disorder developed against the background of senile dementia and professional deformation. They tried to convince the jury that he sincerely believed in his mission to save Drake Robinson and did not realize the criminality of his actions. However, this strategy was completely destroyed by the prosecution, who presented the main evidence, the very black diaries found in the forest dugout. The prosecutor read out excerpts from the records, and the room was dead silent. These texts did not contain the ravings of a madman. There was cold mathematical calculation. Wayne recorded the costs of equipment, calculated the dosage of drugs to the nearest milligram, and analyzed the logistics of food delivery so as not to arouse suspicion in local stores. He planned every step of the way, realizing the risks and how to avoid them. A psychiatric examination confirmed this. Silas Wayne had a narcissistic personality disorder and sadistic tendencies, but he was well aware of the difference between good and evil. He simply chose evil, believing himself to be above the law. After 4 hours of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all charges, including kidnapping, torture, and illegal detention. The judge sentenced the 70-year-old Wayne to life in prison without parole. When the sentence was announced, Wayne did not even bat an eye. For Drake Robinson, this sentence was just a legal point that had little impact on his personal struggle. His physical wounds healed relatively quickly. He gained weight in a few months, and the marks from the electroshock collar turned into pale scars. But mental recovery was a process that doctors called a slow return from the darkness. According to medical reports, even a year after his release, the boy retained the behavioral patterns he had acquired in the laboratory. His mother, in a private conversation with a journalist that later became part of a documentary article, said that the hardest nights were the nights. Drake categorically refused to sleep on a soft bed. Every time his parents came into his room in the morning, they found him on the floor, curled up in a tight ball in the corner, as far away from the windows as possible. It was a habit developed by a month of living in a cramped cage and den. Even more frightening was his reaction to sounds. Wayne used whistles and bells as signals for punishment or feeding. This reflex, fixed at the subconscious level, stayed with Drake for a long time. One day, while walking in the park, someone whistled, calling the dog. According to witnesses, the 18-year-old boy instantly fell to the ground, covering his head with his hands and trembling with uncontrollable terror. He was relearning to trust people, to speak without pauses, to look into their eyes. The doctors stated that part of his personality, the carefree youth that he had before the hike, had disappeared forever. In its place was wariness and a deep, quiet fear that did not disappear even in safety. The Robinson family could not stay in their home. The sight of the mountains on the horizon was an unbearable reminder of what they had experienced. They sold all their possessions and moved to another state, choosing an area where the landscape was made up of only plains. They changed their phone numbers, limited their contacts with the press, and tried to build a new life where the word forest was forbidden. Drake entered college 2 years after the events, choosing a specialty related to computer technology, a field where everything is logical, controlled, and most importantly, takes place indoors. Drake Robinson's story has remained in police archives and the memory of locals as a dark legend. Tourists continue to come to the foot of Standing Rock Indian, admire the views from observation decks, and hike the Appalachian Trail. But for those who know the details of the case, this forest will never be just a vacation spot again. This case has become a cruel lesson. Wildlife is dangerous with its abysses, cold, and predators. But the greatest threat can be a human face. Danger is not only a bear in the thicket, it is the eyes watching through the lens of a hidden camera. It is the patience of a hunter waiting for a lonely traveler. It is the understanding that in the deafening silence of the forest, a cry for help may not be heard by a rescuer, but by the one who created that silence. And while thousands of people pack their backpacks every year, hoping to find unity with nature, somewhere in the archives there is a folder with the file of Object 14, reminding us that sometimes not everyone returns from the forest, and those who do are never the same.